The Metropolitan County of Merseyside was created in 1974, and it had a very awkward boundary, which detached the urbanised zone of Northern Wirral and south-west Lancashire's urban centres, the towns and cities, bulging to the east, taking St Helens, obviously Liverpool, and then taking in Southport at the top there, snaking along the coast in a rather awkward way to embrace a reluctant Southport, perhaps. It cut brazenly across the ancient boundaries, the major provincial tribal boundary in the Iron Age, and provincial boundary in the Roman period, kingdom boundaries in the Anglo-Saxon period, shire boundaries from the 11th century onwards. It paid no heed to people's sense of historic entities or people's sense of identity. It had a population. It has a population of about 1.5 million people, but the metropolitan county itself had a rather short life. It was killed off by a local government reorganisation in 1986, and I'm not sure that it was much lamented. Sorry, Ben, I know it's your life that I'm talking about here and your work. But Merseyside Archaeological Society, the society connected, obviously, with that new metropolitan county, was born in response to a threat, and Mark has set out very well in 1976, the catalyst for the society's origin was the destruction of archaeological sites, the old huts being one of the main catalysts. And it's interesting, I've got in the extension of the Ford factory, and I should say nearly in the extension of the Ford factory. Di Morgan expressed it in the first Society journal that the volunteer diggers arrived in the wake of the bulldozers. As Mark has said, or as Mark has hinted, the early foundation of the Society was down to a relatively small number of energetic and persuasive individuals with the vision to see what could be done to prevent the continued loss of the sites, a theme to which we'll return in a moment. And the foundation of the Society lay in an awareness and an alarm over the uncontrolled destruction of sites. The recognition was there too that little was known about the archaeology of this new metropolitan county. It hadn't been subject to detailed scrutiny or investigation, and was very vulnerable, therefore, to damage through ignorance. At the same time as the foundation of the Society, Merseyside County Council, anybody remember that, along with the Merseyside County Museums and the University of Liverpool, was creating a post of field archaeologist as a result of this, this alarm over the loss of sites. And to place the role of archaeology on a sound institutional footing. And Brian Shepherd, the first field archaeologist from Merseyside, recalled in a Council for British Archaeology conference presentation in 1978, only a couple of years after the post was created, how a partnership was central to the practice of archaeology in Merseyside. And he set out there the division of responsibilities established in the late 1970s. It sounded like a total nightmare. The Society would provide manpower, organise excavations and public relations, and publish the results. The DOE, Department of Environment, would fund the appointment of a field archaeologist for 3 years. The county museums would provide a base for the survey. The county planning department would provide maps, information and financial supports. And the University of Liverpool would act as an employer. And its Institute of Extension Studies would organise students in documentary research and fieldwork. Well, I wonder how much time was spent in meetings. Perhaps Jill might be able to comment. What was interesting, though, it seemed to work extremely well, and as a model, one wouldn't like to emulate it, but in terms of its impact was really very powerful. So at the outset, then, complementary roles were envisaged for the Society in relation to these main institutions, and perhaps to some extent in contrast to the Victorian learned societies that were much better established. From the outset, an integrated role with these other bodies was envisaged. It was anticipated the Merseyside Archaeological Society would be active in fieldwork, PR and publication. But what of the role of the problem of the new county? How was this new county going to work archaeologically? Peter Davey put it very succinctly in 1977, Merseyside is a new county still seeking its identity, but to find this, it first needs to understand its past. There has been no long antiquarian tradition of research and excavation in this area, this part of Lancashire and Cheshire. There's little interest in this region from the members of the long-established county societies. Liverpool didn't have a classic Roman past. Lancashire and Cheshire Historic Society did publish occasional articles on archaeological matters for the county area, but basically this was an area that was thoroughly under-researched. And there was a problem of perception for this heavily urbanised area too, at a time when the post-medieval deposits were still being machined off to get to what was interesting, the Roman and the medieval. Merseyside was rather short of obvious archaeological sites. It had a long destroyed castle in Liverpool, of which that's Castle Nose site, in case you're wondering why I've got that on. And that's where the castle once stood, but is no longer there. It had a single monastic site, which is Birkenhead Priory. It did possess 3 medieval towns or boroughs: Liverpool itself, Prescott, which happened to be superbly documented from the late 16th century onwards, and Newton-le-Willows. And then there was one enigmatic, clearly important site at Mells in North Wirral, of which more in a moment. There was only, though, at that time, a single known possible Roman farmstead in the whole county area, while the complete record of Roman finds for Knowsley district consisted of the grand total of 3 Roman coins. Now there are more excavated Romano-British farmsteads in Knowsley than there were individual finds in the 70s and 80s. Early field walking programmes across Wirral produced very little in the way of medieval or Roman pottery, which would have been seen as commonplace in other regions of England. The rich and important industrial heritage was seen to a large extent as the preserve of industrial archaeologists. It wasn't quite mainstream and required an understanding of processes that most arts-trained archaeologists had little idea of. There was an old joke told in Manchester in the 1980s, for anyone who complained that there wasn't much archaeology in Manchester, the reply was, at least it's not Merseyside. We don't say that anymore. Characterising the archaeological resource was thus the vital first step, and the fundamental, obviously, basis of that was the creation of a systematic database of sites, buildings, find spots with detailed grid references. The Merseyside Sites and Monuments Record, now the Historic Environment Record, which Ben will be talking about tomorrow. This was used to identify archaeological potential in making planning decisions in development control, ensuring sites weren't lost without record. And between the late 1970s and the early 80s, the Merseyside District Rural Fringes reports were commissioned to provide a base level record of sites and of the development of the landscape and settlement within it. The detailed research, documentary studies, the maps, the find spots, the excavations were the raw material which Ron Cowell, over there, Jen Lewis, who isn't here, Jill Chitty, who is here, sitting over there, brought their very considerable knowledge to bear on the rural areas around the urban core of Merseyside. And produced initially for the 5 metropolitan districts, these are detailed surveys of archaeological, historical information on the districts, set in a wider context. And from the first, the Archaeological Society began to take on the responsibilities envisaged by Brian Shepherd. The report for Wirral was published by the Society in its second journal in 1978. The others, sadly, remained internal documents for the council, somewhat accessible to the wider public, but in recognition of their value, continuing value today, 30, 40 years on, Society made these reports available in 2002 as one of the volumes of the journal. And they remain a fundamental reference for the archaeology of the county area today. Now, another role of the Society, which is really one of the ways in which most people encounter the Society, I suppose, is there are 3, I suppose, key activities, all of which involve a great deal of work and organisation. And I'm not really going to say very much about them, other than really as a sort of thank you to those who've been involved in that. The often thankless task is of organising field trips and speakers for the monthly lectures. The Society has a lecture programme over the autumn to spring with a mix of local and national, regional, to the downright exotic. I remember Barry talking about about New Zealand, and other people have been talking about the site immediately under our feet, so you couldn't get much more diverse than that. And together with the newsletter and now the Facebook page, which has nearly 250 friends, they form the backbone of the Society's public involvement. And as with any society, there's a dedicated core of active and committed people who take on much of the burden of running those activities. It would be invidious to name names. You know who you are. Thanks, Morris. From publication is one of the main characteristics identified right at the beginning by Brian Shepherd and by the Society itself. And from the early days of the Society, it's published a journal appearing for the first time in 1977 and has produced 15 volumes in 40 years. That isn't quite an annual journal, I do recognise that, but anybody who's on the publication committee, like what I am, trying to get stuff out of people is extremely difficult. And then, once you get it, then you've got to do something with it, which is even worse. So you've got to typeset it, edit it, and so on. So I think that's a fairly substantial achievement. But the journal has proved a valuable resource. It's an outlet to publish new research from Merseyside and occasionally beyond the area. And alongside local reports of sort of local value, not necessarily national significance, the journal has included some important research papers. Sorry, I'm out of kilter here, of course. Right, was on. One of those is, which will emerge in due course, is the typology of Rainford clay tobacco pipes, which David Higgins produced a few years ago. There have been theme volumes on Prescott and published conferences which have presented chronological overviews of Merseyside and its adjacent region at the 15 and 25-year stages of Merseyside's Archaeological Society's life. The latest themed volume on Speak, and I will have to put it on here, on Speak Hall, represents the distillation of decades of work by Jen Lewis and Tony Tibbles and others on the hall, placing on record the definitive study of the hall, looking particularly in great detail at the dating sequence, which is a significant achievement. There are other sites have remained, have effectively been, we keep coming back to. One of them is, well, I'm going back literally, of course, and one of those is Mells on the North Wirral coast, one of the most significant sites in Merseyside, recognised since the middle of the 19th century as a safe, as a port and a safe haven from the Iron Age right through to the medieval period. But typically for Merseyside, it was notable in part for no longer existing. Its discovery occurred through coastal erosion. And here you can see Charles Ives' map from the 1792 showing the vast amount of coastal erosion. And there is Mells today, the archaeological site, as you can see, less than spectacular. But it was an article by Jill Chitty and Margaret Warhurst in 1977 in the first journal that was instrumental in re-evaluating the finds and the significance of the site, which stimulated, to some extent, not solely, but stimulated David Griffiths from Oxford University to begin to re-evaluate the finds across 5 museums, rather than just the one museum here, which Jill and Margaret looked at. And without that article, it's doubtful that the site would have received that modern profile, alerting a new generation of scholars to the existence of the importance of the site and the existence of those museum collections. And there we have, as a result, the stimulus, and then the slightly longer version of that, which embraced all of the museum collections in 2007. Sorry, someone else. That's David Higgins' clay tobacco pipes sequence. Another subject that's seen repeated revisiting is the Calderstones, the Neolithic chambered tomb just outside Liverpool, subject of a small book published in 1984 by Ron Cowell and Margaret Warhurst, and in about 10 years ago, a new opportunity with rephotographing the stones using high quality, high resolution digital photography enabled us to, the Society to republish with Ron Cowell's new text, the Cornerstones book yet again. And another subject that's seen repeated attention is the Archaeology of Liverpool. And this is the second version of The Changing Face of Liverpool. The first one covered a slightly shorter time period. But in 2006, the Society got a grant from the Liverpool City Council and the Capital and Culture Company to employ the services of first-class historical researchers, David Harth and Julie McLaughlin-Cook, Jennifer Woodcock and Dave Roberts, and other members of the Society in the Liverpool Record Office to revise and enlarge this book. It's an excellent piece of work. It's in the best piece of work, the best book on the archaeology of Liverpool, and is not as well known as it deserves. And it shows how Liverpool was transformed from a small fishing and farming hamlet to the second port of empire. If you don't have a copy, put that right. Another role that the Society has had is advocacy, and I'm going to mention very briefly that when the Merseyside Archaeological Advisory Service, the funding was withdrawn from that by the 5 districts. It was based here in the museum in Liverpool, National Museum of Liverpool. When the funding was withdrawn, the Society was very vocal in trying to stimulate the districts to reconsider that decision. Dave Roberts, sitting over there at the desk, appeared on Radio 4 with Mike Hayworth of the CBA, arguing that it was not acceptable in this day and age to have a county area which had no archaeological development control at all and had no officer responsible for maintaining the HER. Well, how effective Merseyside Archaeological Society's advocacy was, we don't know, but certainly it would have played a part in that decision. And after a couple of years, the funding was restored and in fact increased, so that now Ben has 2 colleagues, Dana sitting over there, and Doug Moyer. So not only do we have an HER officer and assistant, but we also have a development control officer, which means that finally Merseyside is back up to what one might think of as a minimum standard for planning archaeology. So the Society's role then in that advocacy is one area that the Society Committee has been active. And another area in which the Society's been continuing the role that Brian Shepherd articulated. The Society would provide manpower, organise excavations and public relations and publish the results. Another area has been, at its most effective, I would say, is when the Society has been working in collaboration with local institutions, pooling the resources, the skills, enthusiasm, the time of the volunteers to work on projects collaboratively. In the early days, actually, the Society did initiate a number of fieldwork projects, recording the Birkenhead Priory graveyard, working with West Lancs Archaeological Society on survey in advance of the M58 motorway construction. But latterly, owing to the strong links with institutions in the region, the Society members have tended to be involved in projects run jointly with other bodies or have participated in other bodies, other institutions' projects. Over the last 2 decades, it's the Field Archaeology Unit here, the Regional Archaeology Department, that has maintained perhaps the strongest links between the Society and the institution. As many of the members of these institutions inevitably are also members of the Society in a positive outbreak of multiple hat wearing, there's been a strong degree of overlap. So the continuing education courses and teaching excavations have been run by Society members and then attended by other Society members. And so often it's quite difficult to tease out the Society's role as distinct from those of other institutions. So when we look at the site at Irby, which Mark showed precisely the same slide in a moment. This was run as a University of Liverpool undergraduate teaching excavation, but also with a generous English Heritage grant. It was a professional research excavation, but it was also a community archaeology excavation, because members of the local society here and local people from Merby came along and took part under supervision, under professional supervision. It was community archaeology. People didn't know it then. So what I want to look at briefly then is a couple of sites where there's a distinct contrast between what used to happen and what happens now. And the first of these sites, rather like the site at Irby, well, actually not like the site at Irby, because there was no funding for it, or almost no funding for it, but it was one of those projects where the museum took the lead, and the local archaeological society here was responsible for much of the work being done. So I'm going to look at the contrast between those two projects very quickly. In the 1980s, a playing field which belonged to Liverpool City Council was being sold off. Do you remember those playing fields? We used to have quite a lot of them. The council informed the North West Archaeological Trust, and the trust commissioned a geophysical survey which identified the fact that, lying as it did immediately adjacent to the site of the Norman Motte and Bailey Castle, built by Roger de Poitou, presumably at the end of the 11th century, there was likely to be some archaeology in the field immediately adjacent. It was decided to try and do some rescue excavation, investigation, to see what the potential of that site was and to see what the geophysical survey results actually meant. The castle was very short-lived, actually. By 1296 there were cattle grazing in the castle ditch. Its garrison and population of the small borough that developed around the castle were transferred to an upstart neighbour, the village of Liverpool, around 1235. But at the time of the excavation, there was no requirement for the developer to contribute to the cost. There was no PPG 16. And the council allowed access, and Wimpey, who were going to do the development, declined to buy the site until we got out of the way, and also declined to contribute to the cost. Peter Davey secured a grant from Barclays Bank for £250 for the machining, and interested members of the community, interested and concerned members of the local community in West Derby, came out to work on the site, along with a large number of society members. And over the course of about 3 weeks, we rescued a number of elements of what was clearly an important site. And there you can see the playing field. The castle is now in a little garden where it remains as a scheduled ancient monument. And here is the area of the excavation. There's an early aerial photo from the 1920s showing the Motte and Bailey. And excavations across that show quite good preservation of the medieval castle. There you can see the excavations. One slight side issue was a chap, methodist lecturers, came up with a coin and shows that it turned out to be William I penny minted in Bristol, exactly at the right period for the origin of that particular site. And there, of course, on that site, as with every other excavation we did in the 80s and the 90s, we had Bill Highcock, who would come along and do his dowsing, and he wrote an article for the Society Journal about the science of dowsing. What was interesting about Bill's efforts on the dowsing was that he identified what he talked about as what he described as a series of walls. When we excavated the site, we identified a whole series of stone-lined drains in rather similar places to where Bill had identified his walls. So, my cynicism had to be tempered a little bit. It was the enthusiastic interpretation of the wall as opposed to the drain, which I suppose one might question. But anyway, what did we find? First of all, clay floor of a medieval building with small fragments of medieval pottery crushed into it. A cottage, presumably, no post holes, but an area about 4 metres wide and about 8 metres long. But intriguingly, this had been set on top of an infilled hollow, which a large water-filled hollow, which is silted up. There it is, busily silting up. It's on the line of a stream, but this hollow appeared to be something like a pond, a deliberate pond. And when we looked at the topography and Ron Cowell's work on West Derby, produced the suggestion that this may have been a mill pond for the water mill mentioned in the medieval period. There is the floor hacked about by our toothed bucket. Yeah, we didn't use ditching buckets in those days, sorry about that. And there's one of the sherds of pottery, very little pottery fortunately, because of course we have no resources to do anything with this. And in fact, it's just been published in the Society Journal, the latest Society Journal, showing how long it can take for things to come out. And there is the site being developed, and there you can see the area we had investigated. But interestingly, if you look across the field here, there is a faint line which continues what was a ditch, and I think we can see that our filled-in mill pond, which produced 6th century radiocarbon date, or a 6th century radiocarbon date, may just be old wood, but is certainly interesting, suggests that that may have been the manorial, pre-conquest manorial water mill. Now, this was moist field, and a cottage was built on top of an infilled pond, suggesting this wasn't prime settlement area. The dating may, one hesitates to pin historical events to dates of sites that you find, but it's interesting that there was a big population rise in the 13th and early 14th century, which may have led to people inhabiting marginal areas which were not prime real estate, as it were. It may be that the Black Death, which brought that population rise to a juddering halt in the middle of the 14th century, may have led to this site falling out of use. The other value of this small intervention, 2 or 3 weeks, 3 weeks I think it was, with the Society's help with no funding, having discovered this medieval building, this water mill pond, we also found that there's Roman pottery there on the site, and also some Mesolithic and Bronze Age flint. These sites are long-lived, and in many cases, it seems some of these sites that are important in the Roman period become important in the later medieval period too. In 1990, there was a major shift in the way that archaeology was done and how it was funded. And this was one of the big changes that led to a massive change in the way that archaeology was done generally within Britain. And I think one of the things that the main impact of PPG 16, Planning Policy Guidance 16, was that it, for the first time, commercialised archaeology. Archaeology became a material consideration in the planning process, which gave leverage to archaeological curators to ensure that, on the principle of the polluter pays, developers would pay for investigation. And quite quickly, there was a rapid professionalisation of archaeology, a shift to a commercial imperative, leaving very little room for the non-professional. And to a large extent, archaeology then began to divide between those sites done for purely commercial reasons and those sites, eventually, that were done as community archaeology to try and regenerate the opportunities for non-professionals to be involved. And one of the sites that the Society was heavily involved with in 2011, from 2011 to, I suppose, 2015 overall, was the site at Rainford Roots, a highly successful, high-profile and sizable project, which was run by the Archaeological Society in conjunction with the museum here. So the Rainford Roots project then, there is Sid Meadows, the man responsible for finding the first pot in the garden and digging a pear tree up. By chance mentioned it to a neighbour, who by chance mentioned it to Ron Dagnall, who by chance mentioned it to David Higgins, who then said to me, do you want to go out for an afternoon and go see if we can find out context of that pot? Well, famous last words, don't ever listen to David Higgins, because, of course, the pot was almost complete. So Rainford was well known for pottery production, so it's quite likely we were looking at something interesting. There's the pot, and there is a group of local people looking at, or two local people, looking at a sagger which they found, because of course we hit, as soon as we got there, we hit the top of a kiln dome, a late 16th century kiln dome. And that then provided us with the opportunity to construct or develop a project which would investigate that site, and I'm going to whiz on very quickly, and applying to the lottery for a £70,000 grant, which had the possibility then through the museum and through the work of Sam Rowe, who's sitting on the back there, who managed the project on the ground, to run a community project which involved people from ages 4 to 80, 3,500 volunteer hours spent and 300 people involved. The archaeological rewards were huge, and you'll see some of those which Sam will be showing later on this afternoon. As a result, we produced 2 books. I'm going to whiz very quickly through. Although they're excited to find crucial pieces of evidence from kiln level. And then large numbers of local people engaged in, I think, about 5 sites that were excavated. We produced 2 books as a result of that, and digital outputs, downloadable resources, a web page, a Facebook page, and all that kind of the modern stuff that people do. At best, this was for me, sorry, yes, it's all right. I found out what Twitter was the other day. I'm learning. At best, then, this was an example for me of the best practice in community archaeology, marrying the professional standards with the commitment of volunteers, focused on a very clear research design on a project which was based on good, solid archaeology. Not, as I would say, of some sites I've seen, given that public money is being spent on them, some of them are a little bit akin to a sandpit for adults. 40 years on then, we've got an HER which has over 10,000 sites and find spots and monuments. We have a lively archaeological society. We have strong representation here in the museum, and also increasingly in the university in regional archaeology. There's a lot that the society can still do. I think that Rainford Roots has been a model for an ideal way of collaborating with big institutions, so that the society and the institution both gain from that collaborative venture. I think that the Society's role in publication has been exemplary, and that's one area that I'd like to see increased and improved. And I think there is the potential, certainly through my current role at the university, we're looking to develop projects which integrate commercial development with the benefits of local involvement, community archaeology and the society. And that, I think, is probably enough for now. Okay.